Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we move to Tivoli, very close to Rome, before starting our visit to Tuscany. This time we visited two magnificent places. Firstly, Villa d'Este, one of the symbols of the Italian Renaissance, and that is an architectural and landscape jewel. Afterwards we moved to Villa Adriana, a true Roman imperial wonder. And if you like our videos, don't forget to like him, subscribe, and enable notifications to let you know when we upload a new video. Villa d'Este is an architectural and landscape jewel of the Italian Renaissance. Located a few kilometers from Rome, in a green and lush area. As for parking, the nearest option is a paid parking, and it is free in areas not marked with blue lines. From this parking in a pleasant walk, you will arrive at little time to Villa d'Este, and of which we leave you as always the location in the description of the video. The price for visiting this magnificent place is €12, which, as you will see, is definitely worth paying. Villa d'Este has been declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO since 2001. The history of this place is linked to Cardinal Hippolytus II d'Este, son of the famous Lucretia Borgia, who ordered the construction of the villa in the year 1550. Adjusted to the splendors of the courts of Ferrara, Rome and France, Hippolytus II d'Este did everything possible to be elected pope, but after the appointment of Julius III as pontiff, he was elected by this as the vital governor of Tivoli. The heir of the d'Este family decides to console himself by entrusting the architect Piero Ligorio the construction of the wonderful Villa d'Este with its springs, caves, and water games, creating his own personal paradise, continuing the building of the villa even after his death. This magnificent villa was built in a valley called Gaudente, where the Franciscan convent of Tivoli was once located, and which Pope Julius III had ceded to Hippolytus, after his appointment as governor. Shortly after finishing the work in 1572, Cardinal Hippolytus died. However, the family did not cease in their task of embellishing the villa and the gardens by adding more and more fountains. During the 18th century, the village fell into a period of decadence, which was worse even when it passed into the hands of the Habsburgs. In the middle of the 19th century, when the Dukes of Modena gave the royal right to the villa, by Cardinal Gustav von Hohenlohe, the reforms were carried out with which the villa again housed important figures of the cultural world. With the First World War, the villa became the property of the Italian state, which undertook a new phase of restorations and opened it to the public. The bombings of World War II damaged the village, and immediately after the war, a radical restructuring was carried out. As a result of subsequent restorations, its appearance and current state. After visiting the Palazzo, where we will admire the frescoes of its walls, and in which we will have an impressive panoramic view from the so-called Hall of the Throne, we go down to the fabulous gardens, which are set on terraces, and surrounded by more than 500 fountains and sculptures that refresh the place, evoking the ancient hanging gardens of Babylon. To feed the exploded springs, the waters of the Aneian River were used, which conducted the water underground, crossing the historic center of the city. using channels, reservoirs, and aqueduct to bring the different parts of the garden to water. Undoubtedly what stands out most, apart from its beautiful gardens, are its infinity of springs. We find ourselves in the first place the beautiful Bicchierone fountain, attributed to Lorenzo Bernini. And that represents a beautiful canyon supported by a giant shell. To its right we find the so-called Fontana dell'Ovato, or oval fountain, so called for its particular shape. In it a statue of Albunia, the prophetic nymph or Sibylla Tiburtina, is flanked by the marble representations of the rivers Anine and Herculano, the Tivoli rivers. Very close is the so-called Fontana dell'Organo. Called so because it is endowed with a mechanism that, driven by water, allows you to hear sounds similar to those of an organ, sounds of which you will be able to enjoy during your visit at certain hours of the day. Very close we find the spectacular Cento Fontaine, or 100 fountains, in which the water springs from 3 very long parallel channels, arranged in 3 different levels that constitute a single hydraulic game. The Cento Fontaine flanks a long rectilinear walk, which runs from the oval fountain to the so-called Fontana della Rometta, which is a miniature evocation of some of the most important buildings of ancient Rome. Nearby we find another sound source, the Fontana della Civetta or Owl fountain, which, like Fontana dell'Organo, emits sounds. Another spectacular place is La Peschiera, or the fish ponds. 3 large rectangular ponds arranged one after another in the center of the garden, and which represent a continuous perspective on the Fontana di Nettuno. In these ponds surrounded by beautiful gardens, valuable species of fish were introduced, which were caught by all who stayed in the villa, to be subsequently cooked and tasted by the guests. At one of the ends of La Peschiera, we find the wonderful Fontana di Nettuno, or Fountain of Neptune, located under the Fountain dell'Organo, and which is undoubtedly the most important fountain of the village. Built on the old Bernini fountain, after 2 centuries of abandonment, it was restored in 1927, giving it its spectacular current appearance. But apart from these fountains, you can enjoy many others, and you can extend your visit to this magnificent villa, which we left to head to another village, equally spectacular, which is no other than Villa Adriana, which, located in the heart of the Lazio, is one of the best-known and most visited archaeological sites in Italy. Archaeological testimony to the greatness of the ancient Roman Empire. As for parking, you will not have a problem, as you will have a paid parking at the entrance of the villa, which for a reduced fee will go out to enjoy this magnificent place. The entrance price is €12, and that as Villa d'Este is worth paying. Built between 118 and 138 AD, Villa Adriana is the largest of a Roman emperor, and in which Emperor Hadrian asked to be reproduced in its interior, the places and monuments that had most impressed her during his travels. The entrance to Villa Adriana opens in a wall of almost 9 meters high, the only side that has remained intact of the original enclosure, and there is access to the so-called Pesile, whose name comes from the polychrome portico of Athens, which had aroused great admiration in Adriano. Inside we find the original restored pond. Next to it we find the remains of the Antinoian built in honor of Antino, during a time lover of the emperor. We continue through the spectacular Pesile, with dimensions of 232 by 97 meters, to the building with tre exedre, or building with 3 exedras, a central building, whose semicircular sides give it the shape of a treble. This building was a vestibule serving the fish farm, the building with peschiera or winter palace, and that was Adriano's private residence. Due to the preciousness of the marbles and the great expertise with which the capitals and the columns were worked, this building is considered of great importance within the villa. The various north-facing environments were used in summer for official banquets. Very close we find Le Grandi Terme, the great thermal baths, which draw attention by their grandiosity. The large thermal rooms owe their name to the size of the rooms, and were intended for middle and low-level service staff. The geometry of these impressive bathrooms perfectly respects that of a classic thermal complex. We can find the so-called poditerium, which performed the functions of a dressing room, the sudatio or sweating room, calidarium or hot water room, tepidarium or warm water room, frigidarium or cold water room with swimming pools, or the gym. Despite the beauty and decoration of these thermas, as we say, they were dedicated to the service personnel, being connected by a tunnel Lacento Camarelle, which were the rooms of the service staff. Following our journey, we arrive at what is undoubtedly the most famous place of the ensemble, the so-called Canopo, dominated by a spectacular pond of 119 by 18 meters. Its function within the villa was to bring a part of the empire very dear to Emperor Hadrian, a few miles from Rome, Egypt. From the architecture to the fountain and the sculptural groups of the canopas, everything reminds the area of the same name in the Nile Delta. The pond was surrounded by columns and sculptures, and the remains give an idea of the magnificence of the walk through this area. The south side of the pool ends with a monumental exedra, which houses a waterfall fountain, and is crowned by a bust of the goddess Isis. The fountain was fed by a cistern, and once activated it could create a perfect replica of the Nile River Grove. The exedra is decorated with Egyptian-style statues, and given its location in the complex of Canopus, it was identified in its day as a replica of the Serapio, the temple of Serapis that raised Canopus from Egypt. Today, it is believed that the exedra was a room intended for the banquets of the high society, during which the emperor's guests could enjoy the beauties of Egypt. We left this magnificent place, and on a higher level, we find the so-called Praetorio, which was identified as the lodging of the Praetorians, who were at the service of the emperor, but is supposed to have been probably used by the service personnel as lodging. In it we find 2 distinct parts. At the bottom we found narrow rooms with wooden floors, and the top was reserved for people of higher rank, because it allowed access to the areas of the palace used by the emperor. Very close we find the so-called piccole term, the small thermal rooms, and that represent one of the most luxurious buildings of the villa. Due to their location and characteristics, these thermas were possibly used by Emperor Hadrian. We continue our walk, crossing different stays of the villa, arriving at the so-called Piazza di Oro, or Golden Square, which owes its name to the rich architectural and sculptural decoration it had, but which has been lost to the lake of time, being deprived from the 16th century of all precious materials, to enrich the villas of the lords of the time. We continued our visit and arrived at the building with Pilastri Dorici, or Room of the Doric Pillars, and which launched several areas of the imperial palace. A pleasant walk takes us to the thermas with Helicaminus, one of the oldest in the villa. In it we find a spectacular and large circular room called Helicaminus, from which the bathrooms take its name. The room had large windows facing southwest and a large central hole called lumen. The lumen could be opened or closed, and allowed to regulate the flow of steam in the room and the access of the rays of the sun, being for this reason called Helicaminus, and was used, as Pliny recalls, to take sunbaths. Very close to these thermas, we find another spectacular building, the so-called Teatro Marittimo, which, contrary to what its name arises, was not dedicated to theatrical performances, housing on an inner island an elegant domus. The artificial island of circular shape, with a diameter of 45 meters, is surrounded by a canal in which the emperor used to swim to relax, constituting a small paradise of peace and tranquility within the impressive villa. And in this magnificent place, we end our visit to Rome and the Lazio, and we begin our trip to the beautiful region of Tuscany.